It's a pleasure to introduce Brad Lusk, who earned his PhD here with Cesar Torres in 2015 and has now turned his mind to making money, right? Or trying anyway, as CEO of a startup. He studies engineering, justice, climate change, and electrochemistry, microbial fuel cells. The title of the course of the talk, though, is Poop, Politics, and Profit. And I just want to mention one other thing, which is that Brad and I did not interact over research topics, but we saw each other dangling from ropes in Arizona caves. So with that, Brad, over to you.
All right, thank you. Okay, so I'm not sure. I know some of you know me. Probably a lot of you don't. So if you're wondering who this guy is up here with this provocative title, Poop, Politics, and Profit, my name is Brad Lusk, and I kind of want to start this chat with, so I decided not to do any slides. So I just want to kind of keep this as a chat kind of vibe. And so I'll tell you a little bit about my background, my history, and then I want to tell you a story about how I tied the research or the implications of the research that you all are doing here have on kind of the broader global ecosystem, diplomacy, politics, conflict. I am the product of Arizona public education. I went to Barry Goldwater High School, where I was in International Baccalaureate program. I then came over to ASU in 2005 as an undecided major, and did a study abroad where I went to Hamilton, New Zealand, and there I studied philosophy of religion and literature, and came back and ultimately decided to get my Bachelor's of Science in Biology and a certificate in History and Philosophy of Science here at Arizona State University. Of course, starting in 2005 and graduating on time, I'm sure if you do the math, you can all figure out what year I graduated in, 2009, which, if any of you remember, was not an ideal year to be graduating and trying to go out into the job market. And so I ultimately decided to do what I think a lot of people decided to do at that time, which was stick to academia or go back into academia. And so I stuck around for a PhD. Ultimately, I ended up coming here to the Biodesign Institute because my PhD was in biological design. And this is kind of an interesting crowd because I usually tell people I have a PhD in biological design, and they ask me, Brad, what does that mean? And I tell them, well, your guess is as good as mine, really. No idea. But a lot of you might be able to imagine what that means, right? It's a really interdisciplinary program. People in there kind of study anything from viruses, like what Brian studied, who talked earlier. To me, I was studying bacteria. Some people were studying smoking cessation habits by using an app, right? So it was just kind of all over the map. So this program really gave me the opportunity to kind of expand my horizons and investigate the different things I was interested in, which were mainly like STEM engagement, neuroscience, and then renewable energy. So I ultimately ended up getting my PhD in the Sweetie Center for Environmental Biotechnology with Cesar and Bruce, and Rosie was also on my committee. And in there, what we were developing were these methods to use bacteria to harness the ability of bacterial metabolism to filter and clean water and also produce energy. So I did that, graduated in 2015, stuck around for a brief postdoc until 2016 to kind of educate an incoming student on electromicrobiology, essentially. Then I told everyone in the lab, I don't want to renew, and I don't want to be hired, and I don't want to have a job. I want to start a nonprofit, which I did. It's called Science to Earth, and travel the world for a year. And I traveled the world for a year. I visited probably about 30 different countries, and was going around to the different labs at all the different countries and highlighting what it is those labs are doing around the water energy nexus. And really the main goal of this was to tell the narrative of how it's not a matter of when the world is going to start collaborating to solve these pressing issues. The world already is, we just don't talk about it that much, right? And so to me, science was this international language through which we express empathy for the world's most impoverished people, right? When I'm thinking about how to provide access to clean drinking water to people, we have plenty of that here in Arizona, at least for now. But we have plenty of that here. right? So really, who is it that we're generating or creating these technologies for? Who is it that's going to benefit the most from having access to sanitation and hygiene, right? So came back from that, let Bruce know I was back. He said, okay, so now you're looking for a real job. Bruce had a startup company that he was just founding. I came in as the CEO for that. We were commercializing a biotech. We're still working on it. Commercializing a biotech that uses microbes to extract critical minerals from water to ensure that we have a sustained domestic supply of critical minerals here in the United States. You can ask me about that after and all of the trials and tribulations that go into tech startups like that. Would love to talk about it. I'm not going to focus on that too much today. Ultimately decided after becoming a professor at South Mountain Community College and an instructor at Polytech that I wanted to get out of Arizona because I had now been at ASU for 11 and a half years, if you count it all up. And so I moved to Washington, D.C. as a National Academies Fellow, worked at the Naval Research Lab, and was looking at how to integrate biotic and abiotic materials. So people often ask me, what does that mean? Were you creating the Borg? And I say, kinda, yeah. But we were really interested in how can you integrate microorganisms with a computer and be able to give a command to a microbe that can then do what you want it to do with subatomic particles, so either electrons or protons. And we were really focused on how to do that with protons because we thought we could have more sophisticated dialogue doing that. I was there for about 18 months. COVID happened, and it's really hard to be a research scientist in a lab that you can't go into. So I decided to shift over. I became an American Association for the Advancement of Science Fellow and joined the United States Agency for International Development and the U.S. Department of State for about 2 years. I was at USAID for about 2 years. Department of State, I did like a 90-day fellowship there called the Embassy Science Fellowship. And the reason that I was interested in transitioning over to USAID is because USAID focuses on implementing programs and projects around the world to do things like provide access to water, provide access to sanitation, provide access to good hygiene, right? Hospitals, vaccines, things like that. So basically, how is it that what we're doing here is implemented out in the field? One of the first things I learned is a lot of the stuff that we do here, like a lot of the stuff that was going on in my lab, very sophisticated biotech is very, very hard to implement and use internationally and globally, right? So I'll give an example of, people needed to do water filtration, and one of my suggestions was, if you get buckets and you put sand in them and charcoal in them and grass in them, and if you have arsenic, if you put metal in them, nails, right, you can have a pretty sophisticated filtration system at a very low budget that lasts a long time. And that was still too complex for some of the places where we were trying to implement these interventions, just to give you an idea. And so part of my role at USAID was to be an advisor on what's called water security, sanitation, and hygiene. And so I took that role and with the Department of State was able to travel to and stay in the U.S. Embassy and embassy housing in the country of Togo. So Togo is in West Africa, south of the Sahara. If you don't know where Togo is, that's fine. Honestly, until I saw the program about doing water development in Togo, I had never really even heard of it, just to be honest. So Togo is just to the east of Ghana, which is a country that more people are more familiar with. It's just south of Burkina Faso, which is like ranked 5 out of 5 in terms of do not travel there, and just to the west of Benin in Africa. And so the reason that the Department of State and the Department of Defense were interested in sending me there is because they wanted me to come up with a water development strategy, a climate strategy around how are we going to ensure sustained access in Togo in the face of climate change through 2030 and 2050. And the real kind of crux of that issue is how are we going to ensure sustained access to water in places where water has historically been plentiful, right? So there are multiple things to consider in the country of Togo. In Togo, it's fairly equatorial, so they get plenty of rain, but they don't have seasons like we do, right? They don't have summer, winter, fall. They have wet seasons and dry seasons. And what's occurring now is not an overall loss in precipitation, it's that they're having shorter, wet seasons. So when it rains, it comes all at once. So everything you can imagine, mudslides, soil erosion, massive damage to property. And then they have longer, drier, dry seasons, right? So you can imagine a flood comes in, it washes away all of the soil, all the housing, and then it's just dry forever. Togo is historically an agrarian society, right? So they're relying very heavily on agriculture. 40% of their economy is agriculture, and about 60% of their employment is on agriculture. So obviously, like, access to water for doing agriculture is a key and critical aspect of this country and its livelihood. But really, as I was going there, I was thinking to myself, well, there are plenty of instances where people around the world in developing nations need access to water and need access to sanitation. So what is it about Togo that the Department of Defense and the Department of State is really interested in? Like, why am I here as a research scientist with a climate background, sustainability background, water background here? And so what's happening in Togo is there is a group that has historical rights to be able to migrate between several countries in Africa: Togo, Ghana, Benin, Burkina Faso, Niger, called the Fulani. The Fulani are a historically pastoral group. So they raise cattle as basically their livelihoods, and they are able to graze those cattle across those countries and across those borders in a kind of free way, right? So they're able to go between countries a lot easier than, say, residents of Ghana would that aren't Fulani. And so as a consequence of shifting precipitation patterns, people that are working agricultural land are having to shift how it is that they do agriculture. So they're having to change the land that they do it on, change the boundaries and the barriers at which they're doing their agriculture. The Fulani have historically been able to bring their cattle through the lands that the farmers are now moving over into to grow their crops. This is leading to an increased rate of conflict between the farmers and the people that are pastoral in bringing those cattle through. And what happens when you mess with a cow of a Fulani person, that cow is like that Fulani's wife, right? Or it's like him. If you touch that cow, it's like you've touched his wife or you've touched him. So they take it very seriously. And this has actually led to conflict that ultimately results in, like, death and, like, killings that are occurring in these communities. And so what's happening is these countries are placing increased emphasis and strife on prosecuting the Fulani, because the Fulani are kind of these nomadic kind of outlanders to a lot of these countries. And so what's happening is groups like Al-Qaeda are coming into Western Africa as far south as Togo, and they are recruiting the Fulani because the Fulani are in a desperate situation, right? So they're coming down and they're saying, this country isn't protecting you, you don't have access to water, you don't have access to the land you used to. If you join us and you radicalize, we're gonna give you those resources, we're gonna give you access to the places that you historically used to have access to, and things will be better for you. And as a consequence, they are being recruited into these organizations to commit violent acts, right? And so it's led to this very complex nexus in terms of how is it that we interact with the Fulani to make sure that they have their civil rights and access while at the same time minimizing radicalization and terrorist attacks that are happening. So when I was in Togo, I went there in July, the very end of July 2022. And it was a really interesting time there because, unbeknownst to me, about a week before I arrived was the first ever terrorist attack by Al-Qaeda in Togo, right? So things were like really heating up, and it was in the northern region, which is where the drought is impacting Togo the most because it's getting close to the Saharan desert. And so why is the Department of Defense and the Department of State interested in having me there to investigate access to water and how it is that we can provide sustained access to water and thinking about climate change? Well, I think it's kind of obvious what their interest is, right? It's like they want to decrease the radicalization of these individuals as a consequence of not having access to the land and the water and the resources that they historically have. And so for me as a research scientist, having the opportunity to go there because I studied, environmental engineering adjacent and these kind of interesting ways to use bacteria to, clean waste and provide access to water. The reason I'm there is because those things that we're innovating and implementing and inventing might clean water. They might provide access to sanitation. They probably do, but they also have these other profound implications for global geopolitics that working day to day in the lab might not necessarily be on the top of your mind, but those are the implications that what you're doing could have, right? So I know my talk today is maybe a little different from all the other ones in terms of my career trajectory and how it zigged and zagged. But I really wanted to get us all thinking about that. When people ask us about what are the impacts of climate change and what is it that our research is doing to address climate change and how is it that that's going to have an impact on the world, you might think outside of carbon, talking about carbon facts or talking about ocean acidification or talking about rising sea levels. You might start talking about or thinking about things that people are experiencing right now, right? I think a lot of people can relate to extremism, strife, war. That's really apparent, presence right in front of them, and it's happening kind of right now, right? So you could think about what you're doing from that perspective, and hopefully as you go into the lab, now having the knowledge that I didn't acquire later, maybe a new sense of purpose around what it is you're doing and what the implications of what it is you're doing might have. With that, I'll stop. I know I'm a little early, but leaves us more time for questions.
Thank you, Brad. You're actually almost precisely on time, so we have some time for questions.
I'm coming.
Oh, yeah, sorry, the microphone has to go to you. We should throw the microphone.
I know. Oh, don't tap.
Thank you very much. That was really very interesting. So, we have these global changes in how much water is coming over what time. Those seem to be so large as to be out of our control. Do you have ideas on how to sort of even out those changes so that during the dry seasons there is more water available?
Yeah, this was kind of an interesting aspect of me being in Togo, given my background in Arizona, because they still get rain in the south. And so I was literally looking at maps and looking at the geomorphology, geology, and changes in elevation and things like that. And I was trying to think of how do we channel water from the part that's getting a lot through a canal to parts that aren't. And also how do we make reservoirs to store it? And then also trying to think about, can we think about recharging groundwater? And where is it that we would do that, So there's a lot of, I think, mapping that needs to be done of where good places for recharge are. And there are certain parts of the country that are really not conducive to that based on the geology and certain parts that might be better.
Other questions, comments, inspirations? Yeah.
If you don't mind me asking, what was one important lesson or thing you took away from your time being in Togo?
Wow, just one.
It could be a top three.
Yeah. Yeah, there are a few things. One is so part of the reason I picked Togo, I had options of a few countries. Part of the reason I picked Togo was one, because the opportunity itself seems so aligned with what I do. But the other was, it was 2015. Togo was ranked the least happiest place on earth. And I'm something about me was well, I want to go see what the least happiest place on, what does reverse Disneyland look like? So, I mean, it was ranked lower than Syria in like 2015. It's like they have like a civil war. So I went there and it was like people seemed happy. People seemed joyous. They were willing to engage with each other, not just, with me. And I mean, it was a different way of life, but everything, like, for the most part, like things just went on, So I think that part was very interesting for me. I've had the opportunity to travel a lot all over the world, and every time I do it, I'm reminded and I'm humbled by how the rest of the world is, is functional, is happy, is thriving in its own way, and it also makes me question and reevaluate like my own societal norms here in the United States and whether or not everything we do is always the best or the only way or the way that things ought to be, right?
So yeah, thank you, Brad, for this really amazing talk. I really like how you incorporate the political part, like really, I mean, basically the access to resources that is heavily dependent on like politics, external threats, all of that. So from all that you have learned regarding that, if you were to establish a system for water access, for example, what do you think, or what have you learned to be the best strategy to guarantee some infrastructure that could last or could be kind of resistance to political threats or political instability that, I mean, in Africa happens a lot?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I will answer it by saying there is no answer. This is one of the most difficult aspects of international development. It's why USAID, Department of State, it's why they have these missions all over the world. The approach is really dependent on the particular location that you're trying to implement something in. I'll give you an example. If we're trying to bore a hole to dig a well to provide access to groundwater, we have to test that groundwater first to make sure that it doesn't have heightened levels of certain compounds in it. USAID learned the hard way back in the late 80s or 90s because a bunch of people were made sick by having access to water that had a lot of arsenic in it. And so now USAID tests for arsenic regularly. But there are other things that we could be testing for that we're not, because a test would cost $100. And the resources to do that, like access to the capacity in terms of labs locally and finances to do that kind of testing on a regular basis, is not practical or feasible to implement. And so it becomes very hard to decide, what's the best water intervention strategy here, if we might not even have the metrics to measure whether or not that water intervention strategy is effective or whether the water that people have access to is potable, right? So it's very situation-specific, nation-specific, region-specific. Yeah, we can talk more about it.
A good incentive to biodesign researcher to come up with a 10-cent arsenic test, right?
Yeah.
Okay, next questions. So far for agricultural manufacturers, right now this trend is used as vertical farming. Vertical farming means you waste less place to generate more food or crops in the controlled small greenhouse. So what's your perspectives for whether the eventually vertical farming will be the one of the eventually agricultural manufacture type?
Yeah, so I think the question is around like the feasibility of vertical farming? Yeah,
vertical farming that means
yeah.
right now in the Virginia, a lot of companies generate kind of issue.
Yeah, so I'll start by saying I'm not an expert in vertical farming, but I do think it's really sexy. And I see it being implemented a lot, particularly in cities and greenhouses. Like I know, I actually did a documentary on a greenhouse in Washington, D.C. that's using vertical farming to grow, what are they growing? Tomatoes and basil and all kinds of different herbs and things. Yeah. So it could be, I mean, it could be a solution. It's probably going to be regionally specific. It's probably going to make more sense in certain locations than others. But I definitely see, you know, in inner cities, people seem to be coming around to it. And hopefully it's an effective way to do like water conservation, things like that, and grow food more locally in the city. I wish I could talk more about it, but that's about as good as I can do.
Well, with that, let's thank Brad again. Thank you, Brad. You also get a special award for the least number of slides.
Yeah. It was 0, but I made one at the